Canada trying to normalize relations with India?
As the Prime Minister has said, there is a law enforcement to law enforcement dialogue that is occurring between those two countries. In addition, as host of the G7, Canada is hosting global leaders for a global conversation about numerous issues: energy security, peace and stability, and trade routes for all members who are attending. And it is therefore important for all countries who are being invited to be at the table.
Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand today asked there if Canada is trying to normalize relations with India. Prime Minister Mark Carney has invited Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, despite an allegation from former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that the Modi government was behind the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince has also been invited, despite significant human rights concerns in that country. How does the Prime Minister square the circle, both domestically and internationally? Let's talk about that with our front bench. They're back. Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. Brian, I'll start with you. What do you think the impetus is behind these invites, and how much political capital does the Prime Minister have to expend on them?
So everything I'm about to say, I guess this is what we do every week, is really just sort of speculating, trying to read between the lines and trying to get a sense of the Prime Minister, the government, and their approach. I mean, my sense would be this. I think that the Prime Minister and his team see themselves as being elected and having a mandate to focus on ensuring that Canadians feel better about the economy, to see economic growth, and to see Canadians' financial situation improve. I think that they believe that that is the main reason that they're the government, and that is what Canadians are going to expect of them over the next few years. And to my sense is that they are sort of just going at that and pushing other considerations aside. Frankly, it could also be that that is just the Prime Minister's focus as well, and that is his priority. But the way in which the sort of campaign unfolded, the timing of everything happening with trade, the trade conflict with the U.S., that is my sense that this government thinks that that is the only priority. So if you take that, it's a guess, it's speculation, but if you take that as truth, then it makes sense to say we're going to invite global leaders to discuss, as the minister was sort of pointing to, trade and how we're going to ensure economic prosperity, and you kind of put all the other considerations aside. Look, I think that there's probably a moment right now where a lot of people feel that the economy has to be the absolute priority, but sort of like we were discussing in the first segment, some of that can come to roost at one point, right? There are other things that people care deeply about. So at one point, you have to be careful from a political point of view and a domestic influence of your foreign policy on the sort of political landscape, that you brush aside other considerations that are incredibly important to Canadians and to parts of Canada, that you put that aside just because you think the only thing you need to do is grow the economy. So for now, I think it'll probably be accepted somewhat because of sort of the way in which this government came to power, but time will tell if it will be the right approach.
Benzie, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it suggests to me that the Prime Minister of Canada's new government lives in the real world, not in a perfect world where we can only deal with people who are wholly like-minded. I don't love MBS as a journalist. I certainly don't love MBS after what happened to Khashoggi in the embassy in Turkey. But I think it suggests to me that Carney is trying to look outward. Remember, he's also invited Claudia Sheinbaum from Mexico, Anthony Albanese from Australia. So it's not just a rogues gallery of extra guests. I think politically it is important. Narendra Modi is an important world figure. 1 in 25 Canadians is from the Indian diaspora. So that is a huge domestic thing. Obviously, half of those are Sikhs and half are Hindu. So there's certainly a complicated equation politically for Mr. Carney to navigate here at home domestically on Modi's presence. Yeah. But India is an important market for Canadian goods. I've been on trade missions with politicians to India, and we are a very important provider of everything for them: food, services, and so on. So I think he suggests that Carney is living in the real world, not the perfect world.
And I certainly get that, particularly about the other invitees. In the Indian case, though, I mean, the allegation coming from the Liberal government, James, was very specific. It was direct about, the Canada-India relationship. It was accusing that government of being behind a murder. It wasn't just like, oh, you've done other bad things to other people.
Yeah, and I gather, look, that's being litigated, but I agree with Rob's broad point, though, there, right, which is that it's a complicated world, complicated actors, and the dynamics in which Canada operates as the host of the G7 conference, and plus these invited guests as well, is one where the Prime Minister has an obligation to look onto the horizon and to look 5 years, 10 years into the future. It wasn't that long ago, for example, with Saudi Arabia that we were talking about full-blown rapprochement and a détente between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which would have had a tectonic shift on the balance of power in the Middle East, given that Saudi Arabia's sort of long-time antagonism towards Iran and the proxy wars that have been happening in that region. Now, that was put on hold after the October attacks, the push into Gaza by Benjamin Netanyahu and sort of the unpopularity of Mr. Netanyahu and what that's meant to that relationship. But you can imagine 2 years from now, 5 years from now, that could be reanimated and what that would mean for Canada, what that would mean for the world. With regards to India, yes, obviously a horrific event, if true. It'll be litigated. Hopefully there'll be some transparency and people who are aligned with that will be held appropriately accountable. But this is the largest democracy in the world. Canada has enormous economic opportunities, and also the dynamic in Kashmir is something that Canada has to be very concerned about and the world has to be very concerned about. And that's obviously an immediate concern now and will continue to be for the next 5 years. So, we can talk about President Trump and what's going on in California. We can talk about a lot of things that are happening around the world, and we can get, bound up in today's anxieties and frustrations and controversies. But part of the purpose of the G7 is to cast your eye further into the horizon, see where the puck is going and skate in that direction, and triage Canada's interests with a longer lens on things. And I think that's what the Prime Minister is doing with these invitations, and I think that's appropriate for the moment.
The last word to you, Tom, and my apologies in advance. I'm up against the commercial, so I've only got about 30 seconds.
Well, I tend to agree with what James just said. I think that Trump is the backdrop of all of this, and Canada is in a unique position at this particular G7 meeting, actually, which is the 50th since it was established. Mark Carney has a lot of credibility on all of these economic issues, and we can't have an Indo-Pacific treaty and not be working with India. The Americans dealt with a very similar situation, by the way, of interference by the Indian government. They dealt with it in the normal way. Trudeau stood up on the first day of Parliament and blew it up. And this is the difference. I think that Carney is trying to establish that we can have partnerships with Europeans, with our NATO allies. We can have partnerships in the Pacific. We can work with other countries, including inviting China, despite the fact that we went through a whole issue involving foreign interference there. So I think that overall it's Carney being Carney. And I think that at the end of this G7 meeting, I think we'll be in a position to judge him a lot better. But I think this is going to be an opportunity for Canada to shine, thanks to the role that he's played in the world before and that Canada can start playing, because the era of Trump is upsetting everything in the economic world, especially our trade relationships.
Okay, I got to leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Brian Gallant, James Moore, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. Happy birthday, James.